The Riverside Estates neighborhood existed in that particular demographic sweet spot where everyone made just enough money to judge everyone else. Manicured lawns stretched like green velvet. Cars in driveways were always the right shade of luxury, expensive enough to impress, not so expensive as to seem desperate. Every house followed an unspoken code: neutral paint, professional landscaping, a two-car garage minimum. Corinne Mitchell lived at 447 Kingfisher Lane, and her home was the physical manifestation of her personality: pristine, slightly intimidating, and designed to communicate success to anyone unfortunate enough to drive past. The pool was her pride. She'd had it installed 3 years ago, the same year her husband left her for his 28-year-old dental hygienist. The pool wasn't just a pool, it was a middle finger to the neighborhood gossip chain. See? The pool seemed to say, I'm doing just fine without him. It was a Saturday morning in late April when everything started. The sun had that warm, deceptive quality of early spring, the kind that felt like a promise before it broke. Sarah Chen was watering her flower beds next door when she first heard Corinne's voice. "Daddy, Daddy, come look." Sarah glanced over the fence. Corinne's daughter, Mackenzie, 13, with the kind of flat affect that worried every adult who knew her, was standing at the edge of the pool deck, holding her phone up, recording the water. Corinne emerged from the sliding glass doors wearing a white linen cover-up and sunglasses that cost more than Sarah's car. She moved with the particular grace of someone who'd spent money on Pilates. "What is it, Mac?" Even her tone suggested she was doing her daughter a favor by asking. "The water looks weird, like the color's off." Sarah watched as Corinne approached the pool, peered into it, and immediately went rigid. Her sunglasses came off. She bent down, really looking now, her jaw tightening in a way that Sarah had learned to recognize. Corinne was about to cause a scene. "Who has access to this pool?" Corinne called out, not looking at anyone in particular, but loudly enough that several neighbors stopped what they were doing. Sarah had been living next to Corinne for 2 years. In that time, she'd watched Corinne return organic produce to the grocery store because it had a bruise. She'd watched Corinne send back a coffee at Starbucks 3 times before accepting it. She'd watched Corinne construct an entire persona around perfection, around the idea that the world owed her an experience without friction or disappointment. But she'd also seen something else. Corinne was genuinely lonely. There was a brittleness to her that suggested that if anyone actually looked close enough, they might find the cracks. Sarah looked at the pool. The water had taken on a pale purple tint, like someone had dissolved a box of grape Kool-Aid into it. As she watched, a wind gust sent a small cloud of shimmer across the surface, something shiny and particulate, catching the sunlight like glitter. "Oh my God," Corinne whispered. Then louder, "Oh my God, Sarah, did you see who did this?" Sarah's stomach dropped. This was exactly the kind of situation that would define the neighborhood conversation for the next 3 weeks. "I just saw Mackenzie come out and notice it," Sarah said carefully. "Not her, someone else. Someone who came onto my property without permission and deliberately contaminated my pool." Corinne's hands were shaking slightly. "This is vandalism." The word hung in the air like an accusation against the entire cul-de-sac. Mackenzie was still recording, her expression unchanged. If anything, she looked faintly amused. "Sweetie, why are you recording?" Corinne asked, noticing. "Because you're going to want proof," Mackenzie said quietly, "for the lawsuit." Corinne's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't correct her daughter. She was already pulling out her phone, already calling someone, the pool service maybe, or her lawyer. Sarah knew from neighborhood Facebook groups that Corinne had used a lawyer for everything from an HOA dispute. She won to a property line disagreement, also won to returning a defective $600 espresso machine. They settled. Sarah went back to watering her flowers, but she wasn't really thinking about the flowers anymore. By noon, the pool service had arrived. They took samples. They took photographs. The contamination was confirmed, some kind of biodegradable craft powder, the type used for color runs or gender reveals. Not toxic, not permanent. In fact, with a professional cleaning, the pool would be perfectly fine within a few hours. But Corinne was already writing emails. She'd somehow obtained a list of teenagers in the neighborhood. There were 6 of them, ranging from 14 to 17. She began what Sarah could only describe as a campaign of suspicion. She texted the parents. She posted in the neighborhood group, using words like investigation and consequences, and my insurance company wants a police report. Sarah watched this unfold from her backyard, feeling a particular kind of exhaustion that came from witnessing human nature at its most petty. By evening, Karen had her suspect. His name was Tyler Rodriguez. He was 16, lived 4 houses down with his parents and his younger sister. He had a job at the mall, a girlfriend named Destiny, and the kind of aimless teenage energy that made him the perfect target for someone like Karen. Not wealthy enough to be protected by parental resources, not poor enough to inspire pity, just visible enough to blame. Tyler hadn't done it. Sarah knew this not because she had any special insight, but because Tyler's younger sister, Lily, was in Mackenzie's year at school, and according to the neighborhood teenage information network, which operated with more efficiency than actual news media, Lily had done it as a prank. She'd stolen craft powder from her mother's container in the garage, recruited a friend, and dumped it in Karen's pool as a joke. A stupid, harmless prank that wouldn't have meant anything except that it landed on the pool of the one woman in the neighborhood most likely to declare war over it. But the information network hadn't reached Karen yet. Or maybe it had, and she'd decided Tyler was a better target than Lily. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as Karen walked to Tyler's house that evening. She watched as Tyler answered the door, his expression shifting from confusion to defensive as Karen spoke, her mouth moving in the particular way it did when she was performing righteous anger for an audience. Tyler's mother came to the door, then his father. Sarah could see their hands gesturing, their body language, the unmistakable shape of denial. She turned away from the window and made herself a drink. By Sunday morning, it had escalated. Karen had called the police. She'd filed a report. She'd contacted the neighborhood association president, with whom she'd previously been in conflict over basketball hoop regulations. She'd posted in the community Facebook group, not naming names, but with enough context that everyone knew she meant Tyler. Sarah sat on her kitchen counter, scrolling through the comments on her phone, and felt the familiar sensation of watching a small injustice metastasize into something larger. She knew Tyler's mother, Maria. They'd spoken maybe 5 times, exchanged pleasant comments about weather and their gardens. Maria was a physical therapist, worked long hours, had that particular exhaustion that came from doing important work without sufficient acknowledgement. She didn't deserve this. Tyler didn't deserve this either. Sarah did something she rarely did. She got in her car, drove to the police station, and asked to speak to the officer who'd taken Karen's report. She didn't accuse anyone of anything. She simply explained, calmly, carefully, that she'd seen a cloud of powder disturb Karen's pool, and that based on what she'd observed, it seemed more consistent with prank vandalism than intentional property damage. She suggested that perhaps they might want to speak with all the teenagers in the neighborhood, not just focus on one. The officer, a tired woman named Detective Morris, listened politely and made notes and thanked Sarah for her input. Sarah drove home feeling like she'd done approximately nothing, which turned out to be exactly what would happen. Mackenzie posted a video on her Instagram story. It was 30 seconds long, shot from her bedroom window. It showed Lily Rodriguez and another girl, Emma Bradshaw, walking toward Karen's house carrying what looked like a plastic container. It showed them approaching the pool. It showed the moment Lily held the container up and poured the powder in. The timestamp on the video, Saturday, 8:47 a.m. Lily's name was mentioned in the comments immediately, then her parents, then came the justifications. It was just a prank. Lily didn't mean any harm. This is typical teenage behavior. Maybe Karen should be more careful about who has pool access. The thread fractured. Some people defended Karen's right to hold the perpetrator accountable. Others suggested that making it a police matter was overkill. A few people defended Lily, suggesting that teenagers make mistakes and deserve forgiveness. But the damage to Tyler was done. The accusation had spread through the neighborhood faster than the truth could catch up. Parents had heard it. Teachers had heard it. The school might have heard it. Sarah watched as Maria Rodriguez came out of her house that evening and looked up and down the street, the expression on her face suggesting she now understood how quickly social proof could destroy her son's reputation. She also watched as Karen, who had successfully deflected blame from herself without ever lying, got exactly what she wanted. Community validation that she'd been wronged, that someone needed to pay, and that the person who paid first didn't have to be the actual perpetrator. Mackenzie, meanwhile, had essentially become a hero to half the neighborhood for being honest about who did it. Helpful, truthful. Never mind that she'd recorded her best friend committing petty vandalism and then posted it online without warning her. Never mind that she was Mackenzie Mitchell, and some people, Sarah was starting to understand, were born knowing exactly how to weaponize social dynamics. By Tuesday, Corinne had decided that her pool needed a deeper clean than the standard service could provide. She called 3 different companies, getting quotes and estimates, all of which ran between $800 and $1,200 for a complete acid wash and rebalancing. Then she did something that made Sarah's chest tighten with something like anger. She sent a bill to Tyler's parents, not just for the cleaning, for the entire amount, plus emotional distress fees and property access investigation costs. She'd written it out in a formal letter, with copies of all her receipts, all her emails to service companies, all the time she'd spent on the phone. She'd even charged an hourly rate for her consultation with a property law specialist. The total came to $1,847. She did this through her lawyer, which gave it the weight of a legal threat. Sarah saw Tyler that week at the grocery store. He was bagging groceries, his expression that particular kind of flatness that came from being accused of something you didn't do and knowing that the truth didn't matter. She wanted to tell him it would be okay, but she knew better than to make promises she couldn't keep. That night, she called Maria Rodriguez. "I know it wasn't Tyler," Sarah said without preamble. "I saw it. It was Lily from across the way and Emma Bradshaw. It was a prank, a stupid prank, but just a prank." There was a long silence. Then Maria said, "Corinne's lawyer already sent us a bill." "I know, I saw. That's not legal. She can't just bill you for emotional distress without damages. I'm pretty sure that's not how." "Our insurance isn't going to fight it," Maria interrupted. "It's cheaper to pay her $1,800 than to hire a lawyer to prove she doesn't have a case. And honestly, I'm just tired. Tyler's tired. We've been getting dirty looks at the mailroom. His teachers asked him about it. Last week he loved working at the mall. Now he doesn't want to go in." Sarah felt something crystallize inside her, not anger exactly, but a particular kind of clarity. This was how the system worked for people like Corinne. She had the resources to make accusations stick. She had the time and money to pursue them. And when the truth came out, when it was proven that she'd been wrong, she could simply move on to the next thing, while everyone else lived with the fallout. "Is Lily doing anything?" Sarah asked. "Taking responsibility?" Her parents grounded her for 2 weeks. They made her apologize to Corinne. But no, she's not being asked to pay for anything. There it was, the architecture of the injustice laid bare. "I'll testify if you need me to," Sarah said. "I saw the whole thing, I can." "It won't matter," Maria said, and she was probably right. Sarah hung up the phone and sat in the dark, thinking about how sometimes the world wasn't fair in ways that had nothing to do with luck or circumstance, but with the simple fact that some people had more power than others, and fewer people were willing to tell them no. The $1,800 payment went through on a Thursday. Sarah watched Maria's face as she spoke about it in the neighborhood, watched the particular resignation of someone who'd been correctly assessed as someone without the resources to fight back. But she also watched something else. She watched how fast the neighborhood turned. Not everyone, most people didn't care enough to change their position based on new information. But the mothers in the Facebook group started saying things like, "Well, maybe we should be more careful about what we accuse teenagers of. And I didn't realize it was actually Lily all along." And most tellingly, Karen does seem to handle conflict a bit aggressively, doesn't she? The narrative was shifting, but too slowly, and too late for Tyler. Sarah made a decision that she would later recognize as pivotal. She sent a message to Maria. "Don't pay her," it said. "Get the police report, get a lawyer, fight it." Maria called her back immediately. "Do you know how much a lawyer costs for something like this?" "Less than $1,800 if we can prove Corinne committed fraud," Sarah said. "Which we can." "How?" Sarah explained what she'd seen. She sent the link to Mackenzie's Instagram video, now deleted from Mackenzie's main feed, but still accessible through screenshots someone had taken and posted to the neighborhood group. She explained that Corinne had knowingly blamed the wrong person, that she'd sent a bill for damages caused by someone else, and that she'd done it with the knowledge that the actual perpetrator was Lily Rodriguez. "That's fraud," Sarah said. That's sending an invoice for money knowing that the person doesn't owe it. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then Maria said, "We already paid her." "Then we unpay her," Sarah said. "We demand a refund. We file a complaint with the police. Sarah," Maria's voice was gentle, tired. "I appreciate this, I really do, but my family has been through enough. If we start fighting with Karen, if we go legal with her lawyer, it's just going to be messy, expensive. We'll lose either way." Sarah wanted to argue, but she understood what Maria meant. The system was designed for people with staying power, with resources, with the kind of energy that didn't disappear after working a full day. The Rodriguezes could afford the $1,800, hit a lot more than they could afford a legal battle with someone who'd already proven she had the money and the willingness to spend it. That evening, Sarah did something she'd been avoiding. She called Mackenzie. "Hi, Mackenzie, this is Ms. Chen from next door. I was hoping we could talk." Mackenzie's voice, when she answered, had that particular teenage flatness. "Okay." Sarah drove over and sat in Karen's living room, a space so sterile and perfect that it felt like visiting a catalog photograph. Karen was in her bedroom getting ready for some kind of neighborhood charity event. Of course she was. Mackenzie had invited Sarah in almost automatically, as if adults demanding to talk to her was just another inconvenience in her day. "I saw your video," Sarah said without preamble, "the one you posted on Instagram." "Okay," Mackenzie said again. "Your mom blamed Tyler Rodriguez for what Lily did." "Yeah, I know. That's why I posted the video." Mackenzie was scrolling through her phone, not particularly engaged. "Why didn't you tell her right away, before she sent the bill?" Mackenzie looked up from her phone. There was something in her eyes then, something that made Sarah rethink her assessment of the girl. It wasn't emptiness, it was calculation. "Because I wanted to see what she'd do," Mackenzie said. "I wanted to see if she'd figure it out on her own. I wanted to see if she'd care about actually being right or if she'd just care about winning." Sarah felt something in her chest shift. "And what did you learn?" "That she cares about winning." Mackenzie set her phone down. "Because once you know that someone cares more about winning than being right, you have to be the one to stop them. Otherwise, they just keep going." There was a logic to it that was almost sophisticated, except that it hadn't stopped Karen. If anything, it had given her cover. "Did you tell your mom that it was Lily before she sent the bill?" "Because she needed to learn something," Mackenzie said quietly. "She needed to learn what it feels like to be wrong about something, to accuse someone, and then to have to actually deal with the consequences of that accusation." Sarah stood up. She was suddenly, viscerally uncomfortable in this house, in this conversation, in the proximity to a 13-year-old girl who was manipulating her mother, and the neighborhood with the particular casualty of someone who'd never experienced resistance. "You made it worse," Sarah said. "You could have told her immediately. You could have prevented the entire thing." "Maybe," Mackenzie said. "Or maybe she would have just blamed Lily instead and Lily would have paid for it and my mom would have learned nothing. This way, she learns that she was wrong about someone. She learns that her accusations matter. She learns that she has to be more careful." "And Tyler, what did he learn?" Mackenzie's expression didn't change. "That the world isn't fair." Sarah left before she said something she'd regret. She sat in her car in Karen's driveway for 10 minutes, trying to process the conversation, trying to figure out if she was angrier at Mackenzie for her calculated cruelty or at herself for not seeing it sooner. The next morning, Sarah received a call from a lawyer. Karen was pressing charges, not against Tyler and not against Lily, against Sarah for slander and defamation. Apparently, her phone records showed a call to Maria Rodriguez's house where Sarah had made accusations against a minor. Karen was seeking $10,000 in damages. Sarah sat on her kitchen counter, holding the phone, feeling her entire life shift beneath her feet. She called Maria back. "Did you not record the conversation?" Maria asked, horrified. "Why would I record a conversation with a friend?" Sarah asked. "Because Karen apparently did." And that's when Sarah understood something. Karen had called her that morning, not to talk, but to get her to repeat what she'd said about Mackenzie on a recorded line. Sarah had been so focused on what she was saying that she hadn't even noticed the particular quality of the silence on the other end, the quality of a recorded line, of someone listening and documenting every word. Karen had turned the tables. Now instead of defending Tyler, they were fighting to defend. Sarah hired a lawyer named David Choi. He was young, hungry, and furious in a way that gave Sarah hope. "This is harassment," he said after reviewing the case. "She's using litigation as a weapon. We can file a countersuit for that. We can also potentially file for malicious prosecution. Can we go after her for the bill she sent to the Rodriguezes?" "Technically, yes. Fraudulent billing is a crime, but it gets complicated when it involves teenagers and property damage. Karen will argue that she was acting on the information she had. She'll argue that her emotional distress was genuine. We could win, but it'll be expensive." Sarah looked at the cost estimates on David's retainer agreement. How expensive? 15 to 20,000 for a case like this, more if it goes to trial. Sarah had savings. She'd been putting money aside for a renovation for 3 years. She looked at the amount of money sitting in her bank account and thought about how quickly it could be gone. Camp A believed that Karen had been wronged and that Sarah was just trying to make herself feel better by attacking a teenager. This camp included the women who lunched together, who did Pilates at the same studio, who sent their children to the same tutoring center. Camp B believed that Karen had gone too far and that Sarah was a hero for standing up to her. This camp included people who'd had their own conflicts with Karen, people who believed in fairness, people who couldn't afford to have the same amount of power. Camp C didn't care and just wanted the drama to be over. Maria and Tyler, by some unspoken agreement, stopped appearing in public. Sarah would see their car in the driveway sometimes, see a light on in the kitchen, but they seemed to have contracted into their house like a wound drawing closed. Sarah found herself becoming a particular kind of pariah, not universally disliked, but no longer invited to the neighborhood book club, no longer waved to while walking, no longer part of the informal gossip network that had once included her. She didn't mind, mostly, but sometimes, late at night, she'd find herself thinking about David's cost estimate and the fact that she was spending $20,000 to fight someone for the principle of it, because if she didn't, that principle would just disappear. It was while Sarah was in the middle of this legal nightmare that something shifted in her understanding of Mackenzie. She was at the grocery store when she overheard 2 teenage girls talking in the cereal aisle. "Mackenzie told me that she recorded her own mom when she asked her about the pool thing," one of them was saying. "And now they're not talking, like at all. Her mom found out that she basically let Tyler take the blame on purpose. Wait, she knew it was her friend the whole time. Yeah, she withheld information to teach her mom a lesson, which, okay, I guess is kind of genius, but also pretty messed up." Sarah stood very still, pretending to examine the nutrition information on a box of granola. "The thing is," the second girl continued, "now her mom is apparently talking about sending her to boarding school for the fall, like actual consequences. Her dad is involved now and he's apparently furious. The whole thing blew up." Sarah left the store without buying anything. She drove to her lawyer's office. "I need you to find out if Karen is actually pressing charges against Tyler," she said. David checked the records. "No, the charges were dropped yesterday. Apparently, Karen realized that prosecuting a case when the victim was exonerated looked bad. Also, Tyler's parents were getting ready to sue for malicious prosecution, so she cut her losses." "What about the refund to the Rodriguezes?" "Not requested yet, but given that the case is dropped, they have pretty strong grounds to demand it." Sarah sat in David's office, letting the information settle. She'd won. The case against her would probably be dismissed. Karen's own behavior was now potentially damaging to her credibility. The Rodriguezes would get their money back. Tyler would be cleared. But the victory felt hollow, because what Sarah had learned in the process was that the entire situation could have been prevented if Mackenzie had simply done the right thing from the beginning. Instead, Mackenzie had chosen to teach her mother a lesson, and in doing so, had created a situation that spiraled into something that no one could fully contain. The next 2 weeks were quiet in the way that violence can be quiet, the silence of something held too tight, ready to snap. Sarah read through the court documents that her lawyer sent over. Karen's defamation suit against her was being withdrawn. The justification cited was insufficient evidence and mutual resolution, which was legal language for Karen realizing her case was weak, and Sarah having decided that the victory wasn't worth the energy of actual litigation. But the withdrawal came with a condition: mutual confidentiality agreements. Neither Sarah nor Karen could speak about the suit, the accusations, or the circumstances surrounding it. It was the legal equivalent of both parties agreeing to pretend it had never happened. Sarah signed the paperwork and felt, for the first time in weeks, like she could actually breathe. What she didn't account for was that other people would be less willing to let the narrative die. The neighborhood Facebook group had taken on the tone of a courtroom drama. Posts appeared daily, observations about Karen's movements, commentary on the fact that certain teenagers were no longer being visibly supervised, theories about what really happened at the pool. Someone posted a timeline. Someone else posted screenshots of the deleted Instagram video. A third person started a thread about how we got here. The entire arc from the colored powder to the lawsuits, documented in excruciating detail. Sarah watched from the outside, occasionally quoted in these posts, but increasingly disconnected from the narrative. She'd become the protagonist of her own story without having chosen the role. It was Maria who finally broke the silence. She posted on the Facebook group at 2 in the morning, the kind of posting that suggested either insomnia or a level of emotional overflow that could no longer be contained. I want to thank Sarah Chen for standing up for my son when the entire neighborhood had decided he was guilty. I want to thank the police for eventually doing their actual job. And I want to say very clearly that the people who participated in the accusation, the gossip, and the spreading of false information about Tyler should maybe think about whether that's the kind of community they want to be part of. My son didn't do anything wrong, and neither did his family. We've been here 5 years. We pay our taxes, we're part of this neighborhood, but the moment there was a story about a kid doing something bad, suddenly we were targets. That says more about this neighborhood than it says about us. The post had 47 comments within an hour. Most of them were supportive. Some were defensive. A few were vicious in a new way, suggesting that Maria was being ungrateful, that she should be grateful Karen had only sent a bill instead of pressing charges, that the neighborhood was actually very nice if she just accepted that some people were more successful than others. Then Karen posted. Her response was measured, articulate, and devastating in its apparent reasonableness. I accept full responsibility for my mistake in identifying the wrong person initially. That was an error in judgment during an emotional moment when my property had been damaged. I've apologized to the Rodriguez family privately, offered a full refund of the amount requested, which they declined, and attempted to move forward. However, I'm concerned that this entire situation has become an opportunity to attack my character rather than to address the actual vandalism that occurred. A young person, Lily Bradshaw, intentionally damaged my property, and while I understand teenagers make mistakes, I also believe in accountability. The fact that I made an error in identifying which teenager was responsible shouldn't negate my right to protect my property and expect restitution. I've learned a valuable lesson about jumping to conclusions, and I hope the Rodriguez family has learned that their daughter's friends include people who will let them take the blame. This neighborhood is strong because we hold each other accountable. I hope we can move forward without further attacks on my integrity. It was, Sarah thought while reading it, the most sophisticated piece of victim shifting she'd ever seen. Karen had somehow managed to acknowledge her mistake while simultaneously reframing herself as the injured party and suggesting that the Rodriguezes were ungrateful for her generous response. 72 comments appeared within 2 hours. The temperature of the neighborhood had shifted again, and Sarah could feel the consensus rebuilding itself, this time with Karen as someone who'd made an understandable mistake and handled it with grace, and Maria as someone who was being vindictive and ungrateful. Sarah got a text from Maria late that night. I'm done. We're selling the house. I can't have Tyler grow up in a place where this is how people treat each other. Sarah called her immediately. You can't let her win like this. I'm not worried about winning, Maria said. I'm worried about my son. He lost weight this month. He's not sleeping. He quit his job. This community has turned him into a symbol of something, and he doesn't want to be a symbol. He just wants to be a normal teenager, so we're leaving. Where will you go? My sister's in Portland. We can get Tyler into the school there. We're leasing the house out. The real estate agent said we could probably rent it pretty easily. Apparently a lot of people want to live here despite the drama. So there's that. Sarah felt something give way inside her. Not hope, not exactly, but the recognition that she'd failed. She'd tried to fight for Tyler, for Maria, for the principle of it all, and in the end, the people who needed fighting for had just left. The Rodriguez's house went on the market for lease 3 days later. The moving truck showed up on a Saturday morning. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as Maria directed the movers, as Tyler loaded his personal boxes into the car, as Lily, pale and silent, carried garbage bags to the curb. Sarah considered going over, offering to help, saying goodbye. But she'd learned through these weeks that sometimes the most merciful thing you could do was let people leave without witnesses. What happened next happened in the way that small betrayals often do, not all at once, but in a series of small moments that only came together into a pattern if you were paying attention. Mackenzie stopped going to school for 3 weeks. The official story was mononucleosis. The unofficial story, which Sarah learned through the Teenage Information Network, which apparently found her less enemy and more reluctant ally, was that Karen had yanked her out of school pending evaluation for psychiatric services. The words emotional manipulation, willful cruelty, and pathological lying were apparently being used by both Karen and her psychiatrist. Sarah heard through David that Karen had also hired a different lawyer, a new one, someone known for being aggressive about custody disputes, and was apparently considering filing for full custody of Mackenzie under the argument that her father was being too lenient on mental health issues. The neighborhood watched this unfold with fascination. The story had evolved again. Now it wasn't about a pool or property damage or a misidentified teenager. It was about a teenager with problems and a mother trying to handle those problems responsibly. The fact that Mackenzie's problems had been essentially manufactured by the situation Karen had created was lost in the new narrative. Sarah ran into Mackenzie one day at the drugstore. She was picking up a prescription, her face thinner than it should be, her eyes red from crying. "Hi, Mackenzie," Sarah said carefully. Mackenzie looked at her for a long moment. "She's sending me to boarding school," she said quietly. "I know, I'm sorry." "I deserve it, probably," Mackenzie continued. "I was cruel. I let Tyler get blamed. I withheld information. I tried to teach my mom a lesson, and I just made everything worse." Sarah realized that Mackenzie was experiencing something that a lot of people in this neighborhood seemed not to fully experience: genuine guilt and genuine consequences for her actions. "You're 13, Sarah said. "You don't deserve exile for making a bad decision." "Maybe I do. I ruined Tyler's life. I ruined his family's life." "No, your mother did that. You just made a mistake." "Isn't that the same thing?" Mackenzie asked. "I mean, if the consequence is the same." Sarah didn't have an answer for that. She paid for her prescription and left, thinking about how sometimes the system punished everyone equally: the ones who did harm and the ones who caused harm and the ones who just stood by and watched. The fall season came early that year, or maybe everything just felt accelerated because of what happened next. Karen's ex-husband showed up on a Thursday evening. Sarah saw him pull into the driveway, a man in his early 50s, carrying flowers and the particular expression of someone about to cause trouble. By evening, it was clear what he wanted. He'd heard about Mackenzie's psychiatric issues and wanted to discuss custody, supported now by his girlfriend, the dental hygienist, who apparently had opinions about Karen's parenting style. The details were hazy because Karen's house became the kind of place that people didn't talk openly about. Too much conflict, too much legal maneuvering, too much personal information being weaponized. What Sarah did know was that Karen's veneer was cracking. She still walked to the mailbox every morning, still maintained her appearance, still projected the image of a woman in control. But there was something different in her movement, something that suggested that the machinery underneath the image was starting to fail. David called Sarah one afternoon in October. "The Rodriguez family has decided not to ask for a refund," he said without preamble. "Maria said that they're building a new life in Portland, and requesting the money would just mean Karen could drag them back into litigation. They're choosing peace over vindication." Sarah felt frustrated on Maria's behalf, even as she understood the logic. "There's something else," David continued. "Karen is being sued by the actual pool company. Apparently, Karen told them that she wouldn't pay unless they testified that the pool damage was specifically caused by the colored powder. When they said they couldn't honestly do that the powder caused no damage, that the whole thing was solved with a standard cleaning, she refused to pay their invoice. They sued her, and in her countersuit, she claimed they weren't qualified to clean pools properly." "Is she going to win?" Not in a million years. Her own documentation proves she knew the pool was fine. She just didn't want to pay for the service. The court is likely to find against her, and then she's going to owe attorney fees on top of everything else. Sarah thought about the bills she'd received from David, about the $20,000 she'd spent to fight Karen, about the $1,800 the Rodriguezes had paid, and then abandoned hope of recovering. Anything else? Actually, yes. Lily Bradshaw's parents are pursuing charges against Karen for defamation. Sarah's eyes widened. The girl who actually did it. Yeah, apparently, when Karen found out she'd been wrong about Tyler, she started making very public statements about how Lily Bradshaw was the kind of teenager who sabotages friendships and creates chaos, and who clearly has no respect for other people's property or boundaries. She's been calling her a troubled teenager, and suggesting to anyone who will listen that Lily is a bad influence on other kids in the neighborhood. Is that actionable? It is when it demonstrably affects her reputation. Lily got rejected from 2 advanced programs at school because her mother mentioned the situation. One of the program directors was married to someone in this neighborhood. They connected the dots. Lily's parents are arguing that Karen's public statements damaged their daughter's educational opportunities. Sarah thought about Lily, who'd made a stupid mistake at 13, who'd learned a severe lesson about consequences, and who was now being publicly destroyed by the woman whose pool she'd pranked. There was a symmetry to it that felt almost Shakespearean. What will happen? Karen will lose, David said. She'll be forced to issue a retraction, a genuine apology, and possibly pay damages. The amount depends on what kind of damages Lily can prove. It took 3 months, but in January the case was settled. Karen had to pay $12,000 to Lily Bradshaw's family. She had to issue a public statement, not just a Facebook post, but a real statement on the neighborhood email list and on the Facebook group, acknowledging that she had made false and damaging statements about Lily. The statement Karen issued was exactly what you'd expect. It was technically an apology, but it was constructed in a way that suggested Lily had somehow tricked her into making these statements. In my attempt to protect my own reputation, Karen wrote, I made assumptions about Lily Bradshaw's character that were not fair or accurate. I understand now that she is a teenager who made a youthful mistake, and that my response to her mistake was disproportionate. It wasn't exactly a groveling apology, but it was close enough to count as one. The neighborhood reaction was complicated. Some people felt Karen had been punished enough. Others thought the amount was insufficient. A third group felt that Karen was the victim of a lawsuit-happy culture where you couldn't even stand up for yourself anymore. But something had shifted in the fundamental architecture of power in the neighborhood. Karen was no longer invulnerable. She had been sued, she had lost, and she had been forced to apologize. The knowledge that she could be challenged spread through the community like a revelation. And then, because nothing in this story happened in isolation, the pool company sued again, this time for additional damages based on emotional labor and harassment. And then Tyler's father filed a complaint with the police department about Karen making a false report. And then someone leaked the video to the actual police, and the detective who'd handled the case had to write a report about how she'd handled it, not well, based on inadequate evidence. Everything that Karen had built, the reputation, the appearance of unassailable rightness, the position as someone who was simply doing what needed to be done, started to crumble. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Sarah heard about what happened to Mackenzie in March from someone at the grocery store who knew someone who knew someone. The kind of information that traveled through the neighborhood via a chain of people who all felt entitled to the details. Mackenzie's father had one custody. Karen was getting weekends only. More importantly, Mackenzie was no longer going to boarding school. She was seeing a therapist, a real therapist, apparently not a psychiatric evaluator, and working through what the therapist described as learned behavioral patterns around manipulation and social dominance, which was code for, your daughter learned how to weaponize relationships from watching you do it. Sarah didn't know if that was true. She didn't know what Mackenzie was actually thinking or feeling. But she knew that the girl had been sent away for 6 months, evaluated, treated like a problem to be solved, all because of the situation she'd helped create. A situation that Sarah, in trying to fight, had also helped create. It was in April, almost exactly a year after the pool incident, when the real truth came out. Sarah was sitting in her office. She worked from home as a data analyst. a job that required a lot of focused attention and very little human interaction, which had become her preference since the entire neighborhood situation had unfolded when she got a call from David. "There's something you need to know," he said. "It's about the original pool incident." "Okay." "I've been getting discovery materials from Corinne's defamation case with Lily, and one of the things that came up is emails between Corinne and her therapist. Apparently, the therapist recommended that Corinne was showing signs of what they called defensive aggression rooted in her anxieties about being abandoned by her husband." "I'm not sure why I need to know Corinne's psychiatric history," Sarah said carefully. "Because in those emails, Corinne specifically mentions that she needed to feel powerful after the divorce, that her therapist suggested she process those feelings in healthier ways, and that she was aware she was not thinking clearly during the weekend of the pool incident." Sarah sat up. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Corinne consciously knew, that she was probably blaming the wrong person, but she was too emotionally invested in feeling wrong to care. Her therapist actually recommended she apologize to Tyler immediately, but Corinne ignored the advice." "Can we use that?" "We could have if we were still in litigation with her, but we're not. The confidentiality agreement prevents you from discussing any of this publicly." Sarah felt something in her chest go tight. "So Corinne gets away with it." "Corinne gets away with it," David confirmed. "But she's paying for it in other ways. The defamation case, the pool company suit, the custody loss with her daughter, the reputation damage. The system is working, just slowly." After they hung up, Sarah sat at her desk for a long time, thinking about power and consequences and the way that sometimes the people who hurt others got hurt in return, but never in the exact way you thought they would. But the story wasn't actually over. Sarah would find that out a month later. She was at the hardware store when she ran into Maria Rodriguez. The woman looked different, healthier somehow. There was a lightness to her posture that hadn't been there before. "Maria, I heard you were thriving in Portland." "We are, actually. Tyler got on the varsity swim team. Lily is doing really well in her new school. We're building a life that's a lot simpler than the one we were building here." "I'm happy for you," Sarah said, and she meant it. "I wanted to thank you," Maria said, "for everything you did, for fighting for Tyler, for trying to make it right." "I wish I could have done more," Sarah said. "You did enough. You did more than enough. You went to war with the neighborhood for my kid." They stood in the middle of the hardware store for a moment, and Sarah understood that Maria had made peace with what had happened in a way that Sarah hadn't. "There's something else I wanted to tell you," Maria continued. "I hired a private investigator just to understand what happened, to have the full picture." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Why?" "Because I needed to know if I'd given up too easily, and I found something interesting." Maria pulled out her phone and showed Sarah an email chain. It was between Mackenzie and Tyler from before the pool incident. Sarah read through it, her eyes widening. Mackenzie had asked Tyler to do the pool prank. Not explicitly, but through a series of carefully worded messages. She'd essentially peer-pressured him into it by explaining how funny it would be, how Corinne deserved a reality check, how it would be the most perfect revenge for how much of a nightmare she is. Tyler had refused multiple times. But then Mackenzie had escalated, asking if he was scared, suggesting that if he wouldn't do it, maybe he didn't actually have any courage, maybe he was the weak one of their friend group. At one point, she'd written, "If you're not man enough to do it, I guess I'll have to get someone else." That's when he'd relented. Or at least, that's what the private investigator had concluded, that Mackenzie had manipulated him into agreeing to do the prank, and that his agreement, while it existed in text, was coerced through psychological pressure. The investigator had also found that these messages had been deleted from both their phones immediately after the incident, but the private messaging service had archived copies. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "Right," Maria said. "So, Tyler didn't do it. Lily didn't do it either. I mean, she did it, but she was roped into it by Mackenzie too. Mackenzie orchestrated the entire thing and then let her friends take the fall while she positioned herself as the innocent party who revealed the truth." Sarah's mind was reeling. This changes everything. "It does," Maria agreed. "Which is why I did something. I sent a copy of these messages to Corinne." "I sent them to Corinne. Anonymous email sent from a spoofed address. She deserved to know that the situation she created was actually orchestrated by her own daughter. She deserved to understand that every consequence she suffered came directly from something her kid did. Sarah wasn't sure if she thought that was brilliant or terrible, probably both. "How do you know Corinne received it?" Sarah asked. "Because I hired the private investigator to monitor her responses. She called her lawyer, she called her therapist, she called her ex-husband, and then she did something interesting." The police investigation that followed was almost comical in its scope. An email from an anonymous source suggested that Mackenzie Mitchell had orchestrated the entire pool incident as a way to manipulate her mother and the neighborhood. The police reviewed the evidence. The messages between Mackenzie and her friends were examined. The timeline was reconstructed. It turned out that everything was true. Mackenzie had wanted to teach her mother a lesson for being, as Mackenzie apparently described her in the messages, a narcissistic control freak who uses money as a weapon. So she'd carefully orchestrated a situation where her mother would blame the wrong person, would overreach in her response, and would eventually be forced to confront her own behavior. The plan had worked. Corinne had blamed Tyler. Corinne had sent a bill. Corinne had gone to war with the neighborhood, and in doing so, she'd revealed every character flaw that Mackenzie was trying to prove she had. The only variable that Mackenzie hadn't anticipated was that the outcome would spiral so completely out of her control. She hadn't expected the defamation suits, the custody battles, the police investigations. She just wanted her mother to understand that she was being unfair and cruel. Instead, she'd created a situation where everyone was hurt. When questioned by the police, Mackenzie apparently broke down and admitted to the entire thing. She'd manipulated Tyler and Lily. She'd recorded them without their knowledge. She'd posted the video strategically to position herself as innocent while sabotaging her friends. And then, when she realized that the situation was spiraling, when she understood that her father was going to take her away from her mother, when she grasped the full scope of what she'd done, she'd let her mother think that the neighborhood was being unfair to her, all while knowing that Corinne's suspicions were actually correct. The police filed charges against Mackenzie for filing a false report, because the original police report about the pool damage was now understood to be part of a larger conspiracy, and for obstruction of justice, because she deliberately withheld information that would have cleared Tyler. Sarah learned all of this from the neighborhood Facebook group, which had erupted into a new conversation entirely. The thread titled New Developments had over 200 comments within the first day. The narrative shifted again, this time from Corinne being a villain to Corinne being a victim of her own daughter's manipulation. People posted things like, "This is a level of calculated cruelty that I've never seen from a teenager. Corinne was right to be angry. She just didn't know it was her own daughter causing the problem. This family needs serious help. This is beyond normal teenage rebellion. I almost feel bad for Corinne now. She got played by her own kid." A few people, very few, suggested that maybe the original incident was still Corinne's responsibility, that her response to the pool damage was still disproportionate, that blaming Tyler was still wrong. But those voices were quickly drowned out by the narrative that Corinne was the real victim here. Sarah sat in her home office, reading these comments, and felt a particular kind of exhaustion. The story had completed a full circle. Everyone who'd been hurt was still hurt. But now Corinne had also been hurt, and somehow that made the entire situation feel like a tragedy rather than a simple injustice. David called her again. "I wanted to give you a heads up," he said. "Mackenzie's lawyer is requesting that you testify in the juvenile court hearing. They're arguing that your actions in investigating the situation accelerated Mackenzie's mental decline." "That's not. I know it's bullshit, but you should know that it's coming." "Am I required to testify?" "Not unless you're subpoenaed. Right now they're just requesting." Sarah declined the request. She had no interest in participating in whatever narrative Mackenzie's defense team was trying to construct. The hearing happened in May. It was closed to the public, as juvenile hearings are, but the results were public enough. Mackenzie was sentenced to probation, community service, and mandatory therapy. The charges were reduced to filings for a minor, because she was 13, and the legal system has complicated feelings about punishing children for psychological manipulation. But more than that, the hearing revealed something that the neighborhood hadn't quite understood before. Mackenzie's motivation had been rooted in genuine pain. Her father's relationship with the dental hygienist had hurt her. She'd felt that her mother had pushed him away through some combination of demands and difficulty. And when he'd left, she decided that her mother needed to understand what it felt like to be blamed for something that wasn't entirely her fault. They hadn't spoken since that afternoon when Sarah had first called Maria, when she'd been trying to fight for justice, and had set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Karen looked exhausted. She was wearing dark sunglasses, not to look cool, but to hide the fact that she'd been crying, Sarah suspected. Her hair was done, her clothes were pressed, but there was a brittleness to her movements that suggested she was holding together through will alone. "Hi, Karen," Sarah said quietly. Karen looked at her for a moment, then she did something unexpected. She asked Sarah if she had a moment to talk. They sat in Karen's car, neutral territory somehow. Karen gripped the steering wheel and said without preamble, "I was wrong about Tyler." "I know. I was also wrong about a lot of other things, about how I treated my daughter, about how I responded to my husband leaving, about how I tried to control everything by winning every argument." Karen's voice was very quiet. "My therapist says I was being a bully. She says I was using money and status to make myself feel less scared." Sarah didn't know what to say. "The thing is," Karen continued, "I knew I was being unfair about Tyler, but I was so angry that day and I didn't want to be wrong. I wanted someone to blame, and Tyler was an easy target because he didn't have the resources to defend himself." She looked at Sarah. "That's a terrible thing to admit about yourself." "It is," Sarah said. She didn't see the point in lying. "I'm selling the house," Karen said. "I'm moving back to California to be closer to my brother. I'm done with this neighborhood. I'm done with trying to be the kind of person who's always right and always winning." Sarah didn't know if this was genuine change or performance. Probably it was some combination of both. "What about Mackenzie?" "She's staying with her father next year. For school anyway. We're working on our relationship. It's not easy, but I'm not trying to control it anymore. I'm just trying to understand it." Karen started the car. The conversation was over. As Sarah got out and walked back into the grocery store, she thought about how sometimes justice didn't look like what you expected. It didn't arrive as vindication or victory. Sometimes it arrived as the slow, painful process of people understanding the damage they'd caused and having to live with that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Karen would carry this, the knowledge that she'd blamed an innocent person, the knowledge that she'd been manipulated by her own daughter, the knowledge that in trying to win, she'd lost everything she'd been trying to protect. That was its own kind of punishment. Tyler had finished his junior year with honors. He was thinking about applying to colleges with swimming scholarships. The family was settled in Portland. They never talked about the neighborhood pool incident anymore. "We're building a better life," Maria wrote. "Not because we won anything, but because we left. Sometimes that's enough." Sarah thought about that for a long time. She also thought about Mackenzie, who'd started therapy and who'd apparently told her therapist that the year after the pool incident had been the worst of her life. But also, strangely, the year she'd finally started to understand what kind of person she wanted to be. The neighborhood had moved on to other dramas. Someone had complained about tree height. Someone else had challenged the HOA board election. Life continued with its small conflicts and its small resolutions, and no one talked much about the pool incident anymore. Sarah still lived in her house. She still watered her flowers, but she'd learned something that year that changed how she moved through the world. Sometimes justice required letting go of the need to win. Sometimes the right thing to do was to stand up for someone, accept that it might not make a difference, and then be okay with the outcome anyway. She never found out who sent the email to Karen with the evidence about Mackenzie. She suspected it was Maria, but she never confirmed it. The anonymity mattered somehow. It meant that Sarah could believe in the principle of it without having to judge the method. One afternoon in June, the 2nd June after the incident, Sarah was working in her yard when Mackenzie walked past. The girl was 15 now, taller, with a quality of sadness that seemed permanent. She was walking alone, not sulking, just alone, a different thing. Sarah waved. Mackenzie waved back. Neither of them stopped to talk. Neither of them smiled. But something passed between them in that moment, not forgiveness, not really, but a kind of mutual recognition. They'd both learned something terrible about themselves and each other that year. They'd both had to live with it. As Mackenzie walked down the street, Sarah thought about how the neighborhood had never really seen the truth of what happened. The official story was that a teenage girl had manipulated her mother and the community. The media version was that a narcissistic parent had learned humility through consequences. The neighborhood gossip version was some combination of both, filtered through each person's own biases. But the truth, Sarah thought, was more complicated. It was that Mackenzie had been hurt by her parents' divorce and had lashed out in a way that spiraled. That Karen had been hurt by her husband leaving and had responded by trying to control everything, which had made her cruel. That Tyler and Lily had been innocent victims of a situation they didn't create. That Sarah had tried to do the right thing and had made things worse by fighting battles she didn't fully understand. No one was a villain in this story. No one was entirely a hero. Everyone was just doing their best or their worst, depending on the moment and living with the consequences. The pool had been cleaned years ago. It glimmered in the summer sun like it had never been touched. And in a way, that was the real ending, the world healing itself, not because anyone won, but because time moved forward and things grew back.